I want to talk for just a few minutes about what it means to be born again. Now, in a lot of Christian circles, especially in evangelical circles, we use that phrase quite a bit, that in order to go to heaven, you must be born again. In order to know and understand God, you must be born again. We talk about a born again experience. What does that mean? So the reason why all of this comes up is because one day I was at work and I was listening to two different people have a conversation. I guess it was actually three people that were having a conversation with each other about life and morality and what does it mean to know God? How do we even know that God exists? And the conversation started out by, there was one person that was talking to somebody else just about a moral compass. How do we determine right and wrong? How do we get a sense of how we should live our lives? Is there anything more than what we can see? And for the most part, they were doing a pretty good job of just kind of trying to use just kind of some natural, everyday occurrences and ways of thinking to point out that if we have rules, if we have ways of kind of looking at having a sense of right and wrong, there must be a standard. And if there's a standard, there must be someone or something that has made that standard. So that's kind of how the conversation started. But as they were talking a little bit more, one of the other people in the conversation was talking about a struggle that one of their family members was having with their faith. Now, the person that was talking about the rules and the rule giver and the structure behind it all was Catholic. The one who was talking about the family member that was having the struggle was Protestant. I don't know what denomination that they were part of, but this was a very interesting conversation that I was hearing take place between the Catholic and the Protestant. Now, for many years, I've been around the circles where we talk a lot about being born again and how that's an experience that somebody has when they come to faith in Jesus. And that's a concept that comes from John chapter 3, or at least for us Protestants and for a lot of Catholics, at least we find that phrase in John chapter 3, where Jesus is talking to Nicodemus about, what must I do to see the kingdom of heaven? So the doctor brought up something that was very important that I hadn't really considered. And I'm sure it's not a new thought, but he said that because he was Catholic and not Protestant, that the concept of what the Protestants call a born-again experience was just kind of a foreign concept to him. And I didn't want to rush to judgment on what he was saying. I wanted to spend some time thinking about it. And I wanted to just really kind of chew on that for a little while, because I've come to find out that, there are a lot of things that we have. There's a lot of sacred cows that we have that don't always really stand up to the test of study. So I came home and I decided to look up that phrase, born again. And what I found is that the term born again is used 4 times in the New Testament. Of those 4 times, 2 times is in John chapter 3, and the other 2 times is in 1 Peter chapter 1. In John chapter 3, Jesus is telling Nicodemus, you must be born again. Not that you have to be a major Greek scholar, because that's not totally important to these things. But what's interesting is that sometimes that context really does give us a lot of very helpful information. The term born again, as used by Jesus in John chapter 3, the word born, if it's taken in its literal meaning, simply means to be born, just like a baby is born. And I'm going to take that to be the context that Jesus used talking to Nicodemus, because Nicodemus's response is, am I supposed to go back into my mother's womb again and come back out again? Based on the usage of a literal term here, or at least something that was being interpreted literally by Nicodemus, a little play on words here would suggest that perhaps Jesus is using the term born again as a parable. And that wouldn't surprise me at all, because that's the way he spoke most of the time, in parabolic form. So the word born in a literal sense would actually mean to give birth. But there's another sense, if you look in some other commentaries or some other dictionaries, in a Jewish sense, it has the tendency to also mean one who has been brought over to another way of thinking or to another way of life, to convert somebody from one thing to another. So that's more from a metaphorical sense, but we don't really get that. Well, we get the sense that although Jesus spoke in more of a literal being born again, or at least he used a phrase that would cause Nicodemus to take it literally, Jesus was really talking about coming over to a new way of life or a different way of thinking, as he describes this to Nicodemus. So now we look at the word again. So we've already looked at the word born. Now we look at the word again. The definition of the word again from this particular usage means from above, from a heavenly place, or of things which came from heaven or from God. Now that's one definition. The second definition could mean from the first, from the beginning, or from the very first. The third definition could mean anew or over again. The second place in the New Testament that this term born again is used is in 1 Peter chapter 1. Verse 3, Peter says that you have been born again unto a living hope. Now, in this particular verse, the term born again seems to mean to produce again, either by repetition, intensity, or reversal. Now, the use of that word reversal is very interesting here. This is also mentioned in 1 Peter 1:23. And again, it's the same phrase, it's the same usage. So, 4 times that the term is used, but 2 of those times is in one context, the other 2 is in another context, but they both have the same meaning. So what's the significance? Can one really go back into their mother's womb? No. Is the born again experience as much of an experience as we say it is? This subject is really a little bit deeper than what a lot of times we really stop and think about. We have a tendency in the way that we think to say that we're going to start at this point and we're going to move forward. However, I don't think that's what the gospel is trying to teach us. In fact, if we go into the letter that Paul wrote to the church at Rome in what we would call the 6th chapter, we read the Apostle Paul lays out this picture of what happened when Jesus went to the cross. It says that when he was nailed to the cross, that he took our old man, the very thing that separated us from God, that was so laden with sin and so laden with self and everything that separates us from our original intent, and he put that on the cross with him so that it died and that it was buried with him. Then, when Jesus rose from the dead, he rose to the newness of life and brought a new man up with him. Not the old sinful one that went down, but a new one that was recreated in his image and his likeness. Now that recreation is very much in line with the definition found in 1 Peter, talking about a reversal. What we see in the Garden of Eden, back in Genesis, back in the very beginning, is that God created man and woman and had them in a perfect state where they had a perfect relationship of love between them and the Father. Nothing stood in their way. They understood each other. They walked in communion and understanding with God. But that was lost. And that has continued to be their problem ever since the garden. Continued to be our problem ever since the garden. That we had an original form that then had something else laid over the top that became a veil, that became a different and corrupt way of thinking. So what does it mean to be born again? A reversal. A reversal, a way of having that veil taken off and restoring us back to original intent, to cause us to change our way of thinking, not so much forward driven, but seeing the value that we had from the beginning, having the veil taken away to see what God had in his original intention for us. So in some people, this is a process. This is not something that just happens as a born-again experience. Something where just they opened their eyes at a moment in time and everything was changed. Now that does happen for some people, but for a good number of people, that is something that does not happen overnight. There's a slow awakening, and I've even heard there's a classic teaching from a lot of the old rabbis that even say that in the Old Testament that often God is referred to as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and there's a significance for that. The significance of the God of Abraham is that Abraham was somebody that just progressively over time had a slow revelation of God as he went step by step by step along the way over the course of many, many, many years. The grace of Isaac is one where we see Isaac appears to just grow up, automatically having an indwelling sense of who God is. We never see any real struggle with Isaac. We never see any real major personality flaws. We never see anything other than him just knowing. Even when Abraham took him to be sacrificed, he just simply asked, "Father, where's the sacrifice?" Abraham said, "Don't worry, the Lord will provide it." And he seemed to just go with the flow, no problem. Isaac just seemed to always know God. Thirdly, there's the struggle of Jacob. Jacob wrestled with God. Jacob originally had an identity that from the very beginning was somebody that was just out to trick people, that was out for his own selfish ways. And as he went through life, he was visited a few times here, a few times there. Finally, the angel came and they wrestled. And when Jacob came to terms with who he was, and when he wrestled it out with God through struggle, that's how he met God. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Each person has their own path. Some person may have that experience that matches Abraham, where it's just kind of a slow awakening over time. Others may have just grown up with an automatic sense of who they are with the Lord and who God is for them. And there is no singular experience that sets apart who God is for them and their relationship with him. Others, they struggle, they come to a point where the battle, finally there's a line drawn in the sand and it's over. Other people may have experiences of all three over the course of their walk with God. At one point, it's a slow dawning as He just gradually shows them more and more and more about themselves. And then as they see that, they understand that, oh, hey, maybe I've known that this whole time. Maybe that's something that's just already in me, but I'm just kind of like, it's just starting to make sense. And then there's other areas where the third grace manifests, where even though it's kind of been a slow dawning of what they've always understood and the veil kind of slowly comes off, that there are particular things in their life that God would then choose to wrestle with them about, so that there would be a sudden change. There would be a sudden revelation that comes. But the point is, all of this works to engender a change in the way that we think, back to God's original intent in our life. So being born again isn't always something that is a forward motioning, a forward moving thing that we would expect it to be. Sometimes it's simply the peeling off of the layers and the veils that have been put on over time, so that we can go back to God's original intent, so that we can see back from the beginning what God had planned from the beginning, so that being born again isn't really being born again. It's going back to what we started as before we got into this mess. Now, in that, I'm not going to say that if you look at the born again experience as a forward moving thing, that's obviously something that happens. As we go through this process, we will learn, we will grow, we will have to unlearn a lot of things, we will have to relearn a lot of things, and we will basically, we do, whether it's a starting point or whether it's going back to original intent, we will start over again. And just as babies, we will grow up into be toddlers spiritually, adolescents, teenagers, young adults, older adults, seniors. We will go through this process. But just think about it. Just allow your heart to be open to what it means to be born again. Don't get caught up in the terminology. Understand more than anything that God has an intention for us to go back. Allow Jesus to transform us back to the Adam that God originally intended to have fellowship and close communion and relationship with from the very beginning. That is where we find our identity. That is where we find our experience. And as we allow ourselves to be changed, born again, taken back to what God wanted for us from the very beginning, that is where we begin to experience who God is for us and who He wants us to be. Bless you.